Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In his essay, The Challenge of Cultural Relativism, one of the key issues that James Rachels is going to examine is how and whether we can, in fact, criticize or even condemn the social or cultural practices belonging to other groups or cultures. And the example that he uses in this text is female genital mutilation, which there he calls excision, a very controversial social practice, widely condemned in the West, but widely upheld and practiced in other parts of the world. So we'll come back to that example. But you should think of many other similar examples of things which in one culture are considered not only okay, but actually the norm, what you ought to do, and then are condemned within many other cultures. And we could do this thinking about times as well. Something that was okay in the 1950s in one culture may not be okay in the new millennium in that same, although in certain ways, changed culture. So the central question here is, should we say that practices in other cultures are wrong, are morally wrong? Should we say that they ought to be criticized or condemned or perhaps even prevented or in some way, minimized? Or if we do that, are we being imperialists? Are we going against what cultural relativism would tell us is okay? Now, it's unavoidable that in saying that something is wrong, period, in any case, we are imposing some standards, even if we're doing it just within our own society, and even if we're doing it in the crudest way imaginable, where you say, I have the authority, therefore I say this is wrong, or I just feel that it is wrong. There's still a standard. It's not a very good standard, but it's some sort of standard. So we're always imposing some sort of standards. The question is whether we're legitimate, whether we're doing something right or valid in imposing those standards. So if cultural relativism is actually right, then one of its key doctrines would be that what we're doing in imposing these standards is we're merely imposing the standards of our own culture upon members of another culture, and then that would be viewed as illegitimate, as in some sense wrong. Now there's some problems there, of course. From what perspective are you saying that's wrong? Rachel doesn't worry so much about that because he has a good alternate line of attack for this sort of thing. And he says that this is the issue of asking whether there are any culture-independent standards that we could appeal to. Is there a culture-independent standard of right and wrong? He has it as a heading. And all we really need is at least one for cultural relativism to not be holding uniformly, for there to be some sort of weakness to it. So again, he looks at this practice of female genital mutilation, and you can go to people in the countries and cultures where it is practiced and say, listen, over here we think that's wrong and we consider it barbaric, but I want to hear things from your point of view. Why do you think that not only this is okay, but this is actually required? Why do you view this as a good thing? And people will give you answers. And the answers that they will give you will not just be simply, well, that's our culture, right? That may be the initial starting point in a discussion, but when you probe a little bit deeper, and it doesn't take too long to do this if you're actually talking with people from another culture, they will start giving you all sorts of other justifications. So, for example, when it comes to female genital mutilation, they said a number of arguments are made in its defense. Women who are incapable of sexual pleasure are less likely to be promiscuous. Thus, there will be fewer unwanted pregnancies in unmarried women. Moreover, wives for whom sex is only a duty are less likely to cheat on their husbands. Because they're not thinking about sex, they will be more attentive to the needs of their husbands and children. Husbands, for their part, are said to enjoy sex with wives who have been unexcised women that men feel are unclean and immature. And Rachel says it would be easy and perhaps arrogant to ridicule these arguments. Notice an important feature of every one of these arguments. Get past the sort of repugnance that we might feel in hearing this and see what's actually going on here. Those who are justifying a practice in their own culture are appealing to some sort of social standards, something that doesn't just depend on, well, we've always done things this way, or this is our culture. It could be, if we don't do it, the gods are going to go after us. That is a standard, right? It may not be a particularly good standard in the long run, but it's still a standard. The one that Rachel's brings up is that, on the whole, people are better off, that's what the viewpoint is, if this particular practice is encouraged and continued. And people will accordingly be worse off if this practice is not continued, if it's prevented. Now, once things get to that point of view, you're no longer talking about something that is just from the perspective of that culture. Because the fact that an outsider can come in and ask, hey, why are you doing this? This seems wrong. And they say, no, you've got a mistaken viewpoint on it. It's actually right. They're not saying it's just right for them. They're saying this is right morally for human beings. You just people over there, you've got it wrong. You're missing out some sort of important consideration, and this is the standard. So if you then talk about these standards, like, for example, does the practice promote or hinder the welfare of people affected by it? This becomes, as he says, an independent moral standard that cultural relativism forbids. And he says it's a standard that can be brought to bear in judging the practices of any culture at any time, including our own. So, let's consider this issue of female genital mutilation, right? You could say to those people, listen, when we examine the people who've undergone this, it seems that psychologically they wind up being damaged by it. You don't want people to be psychologically damaged. That's not to their welfare, is it? So, maybe you should stop doing that practice. Or genuine intimacy can take all these different forms and shapes, and depriving somebody of, you might call it the organ of their intimacy, or a portion of that, is interfering with that possibility of something that could be happening and isn't. And wouldn't that be conducive to people's welfare as well? And we could do this with any other controversial social practice that's found in one culture and not in another culture. We could make it depend on welfare. We could make it depend on notions of rights. We could make it depend on all sorts of other moral principles that would straddle and run through different cultures. Rachel's then discusses, well, why are we reluctant then, since we have all sorts of standards available to us, why are we reluctant to condemn the practices of other cultures? And he says there's actually some good reasons. Not completely good reasons, not reasons that would actually militate against ever condemning another culture, but somewhat good reasons for being reluctant to condemn practices. One, particularly for people in the West, but really this could apply to any dominant culture, there are concerns about interference with others' social customs, with their sets of norms. Do we actually have the right to do so? As he points out, Europeans and their descendants in America do have a shameful history of destroying native cultures in the name of Christianity and Enlightenment in a sort of religious and a secular, philosophical, social point of view, right? So, we might be concerned about continuing that, and he says that does make sense. And so some people refuse to criticize other cultures, but he says there's a difference between two things. One is making a judgment, saying this is actually wrong, this is morally wrong. Another is acting upon that judgment and saying, therefore, we're going to send in the troops or regulate you with law or impose some sort of economic sanctions or something along those lines. And although it may often, be the case that doing A does lead to B, we do have to recognize that they're not equivalent and they're not identical. So there's nothing wrong with condemning something that we actually think is wrong. As a matter of fact, that's what they do in other cultures. But we have to be wary about what level of other actions we're going to have flow from that condemnation or criticism. Another thing that he talks about here is valuing tolerance positively. People may feel, and he says rightly enough, that we should be tolerant of other cultures. Tolerance is no doubt a virtue. A tolerant person can live in peace with those who see things differently. It doesn't require saying everybody's right, but it does require saying I'm going to live with you and not engage in conflict with you. But that doesn't mean that we need to be tolerant of everything. And as he points out, no culture is actually completely tolerant. They all have some things that they say are off limits. So he says, if we did not think some things were better than others, there would be nothing for us to tolerate. Then the final thing that he talks about are concerns that we might be expressing contempt for somebody's entire culture in criticizing a particular practice. And he says, this is just a mistake. Unless we are intending to criticize the entire culture by pointing at, look at what these people do, right? We're not actually doing that. He says, to condemn a particular practice is not to say the culture on the whole is contemptible. As a matter of fact, the culture could have many admirable features, and you might actually use those admirable features in order to make the case to people of that culture that they should reconsider the practice that they are engaging in. So, long story short, from Rachel's point of view, we actually can and should, if we're going to be moral beings, condemn practices in other cultures that we think are immoral. Of course, we should apply the same standard to ourselves, but we do have a sort of apparatus here in social standards or universal standards that go beyond those of a mere culture. We have something in those to appeal to across different cultures.